In January of 1888, when the temperature in Kansas dropped to 47 degrees below zero and 67 people froze to death in 3 days, there was a 28-year-old widow cooking fish stew for her son inside a limestone cave, wearing nothing but a thin cotton shirt. 6 weeks earlier, her father-in-law had thrown her out of his house with $23 and a curse. He said she would be dead before Christmas. He was wrong, but to understand how Elara Marsh came to survive the deadliest blizzard in Kansas history, we need to go back to the beginning, back to a cold December morning when everything she had built over 6 years came crashing down around her. The frost on the windows had formed patterns that looked like ferns, delicate and beautiful in the early light. Elara stood at the kitchen window of the Marsh Ranch house, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the sun rise over the frozen prairie. Behind her, she could hear the soft padding of paws on the wooden floor. Odin, her Norwegian elk-hound, pressed his grey-furred body against her leg, his dark eyes watchful. She had been happy here once. For 6 years, this had been her home. She had learned to love the endless Kansas sky, the way the wheat fields turned golden in summer, the sound of Samuel's laughter echoing through these rooms. Samuel, 4 months since the horse had thrown him. 4 months since she had found him lying in the north pasture, his neck twisted at an angle that told her everything before she even reached his side. 4 months of grief so heavy it felt like stones sewn into her chest. And now this. The summons had come at breakfast. Cornelius Marsh, her father-in-law, had sent one of the ranch hands to fetch her. His voice had been cold when he spoke, colder than the December wind that rattled the windows. Elara walked through the house one last time, her fingers trailing along surfaces she had polished 1,000 times. The dining table where she and Samuel had shared their meals, the fireplace mantel where she had arranged dried flowers every spring, the bedroom door still closed, where she could not bear to sleep any more. Odin followed her silently, his nails clicking on the hard wood. In the front parlor, Cornelius Marsh sat in his high-backed chair like a king on a throne. He was 65 years old, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had never held warmth for her. Beside him stood his younger son, Horace, 24 years old and wearing the smug expression of a man who had already won. Adelaide Marsh sat by the window with her needlework, her 62-year-old fingers moving with mechanical precision. This was the woman Elara had nursed through pneumonia 2 winters ago, sitting up through fever dreams, spooning broth between cracked lips when Adelaide was too weak to feed herself. Now she studied her embroidery as if it contained the secrets of the universe, refusing to meet Elara's eyes. Cornelius did not invite Elara to sit. The words came out flat and final, like nails being driven into a coffin. A widow with no sons to work the land is a mouth that takes but never gives. Elara felt the blood drain from her face. She had worked this ranch as hard as any hired hand. She could rope and brand and break horses. She had helped deliver calves during difficult births, had mended fences in summer heat and winter cold. But none of that mattered to Cornelius Marsh. She was a woman without a husband, and therefore she was nothing. Horace stepped forward, his smile widening. "My bride arrives next week. We will need the house." Elara looked at Adelaide, searching for any sign of the woman she had saved. But Adelaide kept her eyes on her needle, pushing it through fabric with mechanical precision. "You have until tomorrow morning. Take what you can carry." The dismissal was absolute. Alara turned to leave, her legs moving automatically, her mind numb with shock. Odin pressed close to her side, growling low in his throat at the men who had just destroyed his mistress's world. She was halfway to the door when she heard it. Horace's voice, low and satisfied, speaking to his father in what he thought was a private moment. The railroad company paid $2,000 for the mineral rights. Samuel never knew, and now she never will. Ilara froze. $2,000. Samuel had always said the land was worthless for mining. He had laughed about it, called it nothing but dirt and rock and prairie grass. But someone had known different. Someone had made a deal, had forged papers, had sold what was never theirs to sell. She turned slowly. Horace's face went pale as he realized she had heard. For a moment, something like fear flickered in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by cold calculation. Whatever you think you heard, it does not matter. You have no proof. You have no husband. You have nothing. Cornelius rose from his chair, his bulk casting a shadow across the room. Be gone by sunrise, or I will have the sheriff remove you. Ilara did not argue. There was no point. She had seen enough of frontier justice to know that a widow's word meant nothing against the landowners. She had seen women like herself ground down to dust by men who held all the power and felt no obligation to use it kindly, but she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She walked out of the parlor with her head high, Odin at her heels. Behind her she heard Adelaide's voice, thin and wavering. Cornelius, perhaps we could let her stay in the bunkhouse until spring. The weather is not our concern. She should have thought of that before she failed to give Samuel an heir. The door closed behind Ilara, cutting off whatever Adelaide might have said next. That night, Ilara packed by candlelight. $23 sewn into the lining of her coat, her husband's hunting knife, the old rifle that had belonged to her grandfather Magnus, brought all the way from Norway when she was 12 years old, and the leather-bound journal, worn soft with age, filled with her grandfather's careful handwriting. Magnus Torvik had been a miner in the old country, had spent years working in the deep places of the earth where the sun never reached. He had taught Ilara things that most people had forgotten, knowledge passed down through generations of people who lived in lands where winter could kill you in minutes if you did not respect it. The earth remembers warmth. 40 feet down, winter cannot reach you. She could hear his voice as clearly as if he was standing beside her, his weathered hands demonstrating how to read the signs of the land, how to find shelter where others saw only rock and shadow. Grandfather Magnus had died 3 years ago, but he had left her this, his knowledge, his journal, his rifle, and somewhere deep in her heart, the stubborn Norwegian belief that survival was not about strength or luck. It was about knowing things that other people had forgotten. Stellan appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Her son was 8 years old, with his father's dark hair and his mother's grey eyes. He was small for his age, but fierce in spirit, with a quiet watchfulness that reminded Ilara of the old hunters from her grandfather's stories. "Mama, where are we going?" The question hung in the air between them. Ilara had no answer. She did not know where they would go, did not know how they would survive the Kansas winter with $23 and the clothes on their backs, but she could not let him see her fear. Somewhere safe, min lille gut, my little boy. The Norwegian word slipped out automatically, a comfort from her childhood. Stellan nodded solemnly, as if he understood everything she was not saying. Then he went to his small bed and began to pack his own bundle, his movements careful and deliberate. Odin watched them both, his ears pricked forward, his body tense with the awareness that something was very wrong. They left before dawn. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the wind cut through Elara's wool coat like 1,000 tiny knives. She pulled Stellan close, wrapped him in every blanket they could carry, and began to walk. Behind them, the marsh ranch house grew smaller against the grey December sky. Smoke still rose from its chimney, warmth and shelter that would never be theirs again. Elara did not look back. The first day was brutal. The wind came from the north, relentless and cruel, pushing against them with every step. Stellan walked as long as he could, then rode on Elara's back when his small legs gave out. Odin ranged ahead, his thick fur proof against the cold that was slowly draining the warmth from Elara's bones. They found shelter that first night in a shallow depression behind a limestone outcropping. Elara used their canvas tarp to create a windbreak, piled stones to hold it in place, and built a small fire from the dry kindling she had brought. The flames were pitiful, barely enough to warm their hands. But it was something. Stellan ate the hard biscuits and jerky without complaint. He was too tired to talk, too cold to do anything but huddle against his mother's body and try to sleep. Elara held him through the long, bitter night, singing the old songs her grandfather had taught her, songs about the northern lights and the deep places of the earth, songs about survival. When dawn came, grey and cold, they walked again. The second day was worse. Sleet turned the ground treacherous. Elara's boots, already worn thin from years of ranch work, let in water with every step. Her feet went numb by mid-morning. By afternoon, she could not feel them at all. Stellan was failing. His small face had gone pale, his lips taking on a bluish tint that terrified Elara more than anything else. He stopped talking, stopped looking at the world around him. He just walked, one foot in front of the other, his hand gripping hers with a strength that was slowly fading. What had she been thinking? The question clawed at Elara's mind as the hours passed. Should she have swallowed her pride? Should she have begged Cornelius for mercy, agreed to work for room and board alone? But she knew the answer. She had seen how the marshes treated the people who depended on them. She had seen the broken spirits, the hollow eyes, the slow death of dignity that came from living at the mercy of people who had none. She would rather die free than live that way, and she would not subject Stellan to it. On the morning of the third day, Elara knew they were running out of time. The snow had started falling in earnest overnight, transforming the landscape into a white blur that made navigation almost impossible. Stellan could barely walk. His body swayed with each step, his eyes glazed and unfocused. They needed real shelter. They needed it now. And then she saw them. The limestone bluffs rose out of the snow like ancient sentinels, their grey faces streaked with darker mineral deposits. Dark openings dotted the rock face, shadows that looked like empty eye sockets in the fading light. Caves. Her grandfather's voice came back to her, clear as a bell across the years. The earth remembers warmth. 40 feet down, winter cannot reach you. Elara had passed this way before, years ago, with Samuel. He had mentioned that local trappers sometimes used the caves for shelter during bad weather. She had never explored them, had never had reason to. Now, as the snow fell harder and her son's life slipped away minute by minute, those dark mouths in the rock face looked like salvation itself. Odin reached the first cave before them, his nose working furiously at the entrance. He looked back at Elara and whined, then moved on. Not this one. The first cave was a crushing disappointment. Shallow, barely more than an indentation in the cliff face. No protection from the wind, no depth to hold warmth. The second was the same. The third went deeper, and Alara's hopes rose until she realized the floor was wet, water seeping from cracks in the walls. The dampness would kill them as surely as the cold. She was beginning to despair when Odin started barking. The sound echoed off the limestone, sharp and urgent. Ilara followed it, half dragging Stellan along the base of the bluff, her heart pounding with desperate hope. The entrance was wide enough for a wagon, partially hidden by a tumble of boulders that looked like they had fallen ages ago. Odin stood at the opening, his tail wagging furiously, his bark taking on a different quality. Come see what I found." Inside, beyond the reach of the wind, Ilara could already feel the difference in temperature. Not warm, but not the bone-cutting cold of outside. The passage sloped downward for 20 feet, the ceiling high enough that she could walk upright, and then it opened into something that made her stop and stare. The chamber was enormous, far larger than the entire Marsh Ranch house. Her voice echoed when she called out experimentally, the sound bouncing back from unseen walls. The ceiling rose at least 30 feet overhead, disappearing into shadow beyond the weak daylight filtering in from the entrance. But what caught her attention, what made her heart leap with desperate hope and brought tears to her frozen cheeks, was the sound of water, not dripping or seeping, the gentle lap of moving water against stone. Ilara moved deeper into the cave, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. And there, in a natural depression in the cave floor, she found it. A pond, perhaps 40 feet across, roughly oval in shape. The water was so clear she could see the rocky bottom even in the dim light, could see the pale stones and dark crevices, and she could see fish, real fish, several of them, dark shapes moving lazily through the water. A spring-fed pond, protected by 30 feet of limestone and earth from the worst of winter's freeze. Fresh water, food, life. Ilara sank to her knees beside the pond, her body shaking with exhaustion and relief. Behind her, she could hear Stellan's footsteps, could hear Odin's nails clicking on the stone floor. "Mama." Stellan's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but there was wonder in it. He was pointing upward. High above them, daylight filtered through a natural chimney in the rock, a shaft that let in light and air, but was far too small and high for weather to threaten them. The faint beam illuminated the mist rising from the pond, making the cave look almost magical, and on the wall beside the opening, carved into the limestone with careful precision, Ilara saw something that stopped her breath entirely. MT 1854, Magnus Torvik. 33 years ago, her grandfather had stood in this very spot. He had found this cave, had carved his initials into the stone, had perhaps survived a winter of his own in this underground sanctuary. She was not alone. Across the decades, across an ocean and a lifetime, her grandfather was still watching over her, still teaching her, still showing her the way. Ilara pressed her palm against the carved letters, feeling the rough stone beneath her fingers. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of despair. "We are going to stay here," she said, the decision crystallizing even as she spoke. "We are going to make this our home. Now, I want you to pause for just a moment and think about this. If you were Ilara, standing in that cave with $23 in your pocket, an 8-year-old son who could barely stand, and a Kansas winter bearing down on you, what would you do? Most people would have given up. Most people would have turned back, would have begged for charity, would have accepted whatever scraps the world was willing to throw them. But Ilara remembered what her grandfather had taught her, and she made a choice that would save not only her own life, but the lives of 11 other people who had laughed at her, mocked her, called her a fool. That choice started with building a cabin inside a cave. The first days were the hardest. Ilara used their canvas tarp to create a windbreak near the cave entrance, piling stones to hold it in place. She ventured outside only when absolutely necessary, gathering deadfall wood from the sparse growth along the bluff. The wind was brutal. Twice she nearly lost her way in blowing snow, the world turning into a white void that swallowed all sense of direction. But each trip brought back precious fuel, and slowly, painfully, their pile of firewood grew. Inside the cave, she built their first fire in a cleared space away from the entrance, using flat stones to create a hearth. The smoke rose naturally toward the high opening in the ceiling, drawn by the draft. It was not perfect. Sometimes the wind shifted and smoke pooled near the ceiling, making their eyes water. But it worked. Stellan helped as best he could. His small hands arranged kindling, hauled the lightest pieces of wood. The color was returning to his face, the bluish tint fading from his lips. He was recovering. They were both recovering. On the 4th day, Ilara made her first fishing line. Thread carefully unpicked from her spare petticoat, weighted with a small stone, baited with a bit of salt pork from their dwindling supplies. She had carved a hook from a bone button, painstaking work that took hours. Her hands shook as she lowered it into the pond. Stellan crouched beside her, his grey eyes wide with hope. When the line jerked and Ilara pulled up a fish, a good-sized one, silvery and fighting, Stellan let out a whoop that echoed through the chamber. "Mama, Mama, we caught a one." That night they ate like royalty, the fish roasted on flat stones beside the fire. It was the first time in days that Ilara felt something other than fear, but she knew a fire and a fishing line were not enough. Winter was just beginning, and they needed more than survival. They needed a way to truly live here until spring. The idea came to her that night as she lay awake, listening to Stellan's soft breathing, to Odin's occasional sighs as he dreamed by the fire. The cave's dry alcove had caught her attention days ago. It was set back from the main chamber, perhaps 10 feet deep and 20 feet wide, with a floor that rose slightly above the main cave, keeping it dry. If she could build walls, a roof, create an actual shelter within the shelter of the cave. She had no proper tools. What she did have was her grandfather's knowledge, passed down through generations of Norwegians who had learned to survive in lands where winter lasted 8 months and the sun disappeared entirely. She had his journal, and she had determination that burned hotter than any fire she could build. The wood came slowly, each piece a hard-won victory. Every clear day, Ilara ventured out, sometimes making 3 or 4 trips before exhaustion forced her to stop. She looked for fallen trees, deadfall that had not rotted too badly, cottonwood, ash, whatever the bluffs provided. She could not cut living trees. She had no proper saw, and her knife, though sharp, was not meant for that kind of work. But nature was a generous provider if you knew where to look. She developed a system. First, she would scout, looking for suitable wood. Then she would test it for soundness, kicking it, pressing her weight against it. Rotten wood was useless. Good wood she would drag back to the cave entrance, a process that left her shoulders screaming and her hands raw, even through her gloves. Then came the hardest part, wrestling the logs inside the cave, down the sloped entrance, across the main floor to the alcove. Stellan helped roll the smaller pieces, his small hands pushing with all his might. Odin pulled a crude sled Ilara had fashioned from branches and rope, his powerful body straining against the weight. The child never complained, though Ilara could see the effort it cost him, could see how thin he was getting despite the fish they caught daily. They were both getting leaner, their clothes hung looser, but they were surviving, and that was what mattered. Building the cabin frame required every bit of knowledge Ilara had gained from her grandfather's journal. She wished desperately for Samuel's skill with wood, for his easy competence with tools. But Samuel was gone. She had only herself. She used notched joints to fit logs together, a technique her grandfather had described in detail. The first several attempts were disasters, the notches too shallow or too deep, the logs rolling away or sitting at odd angles. Her hunting knife became an extension of her hand as she learned to carve the notches properly, learned to judge angles and depths by eye and feel. Without proper nails or metal fasteners, she used wooden pegs sharpened with painful care, hammered into place with rocks. Her hands were soon raw and bleeding despite the leather gloves she wore whenever possible. She wrapped her damaged palms with strips torn from her petticoat and kept working. The walls rose slowly, log by painful log. Ilara chinked the gaps between them with a mixture she developed through trial and error. Clay she dug from the pond's edge, mixed with dried grass she had gathered before the worst snows came, and fish oil rendered from catches that were too small to be worth eating whole. The mixture was messy to work with and smelled terrible while wet, but it dried hard and kept out drafts remarkably well. Her grandfather's words guided her every step. Still air is the best insulator God ever made. 6 inches of trapped air between 2 layers of wood equals 4 inches of solid wood for keeping warmth. So she built double walls, an inner layer and an outer layer, with a 6-inch gap between them filled with dry earth. It was twice the work, but it would be twice the protection. For a roof, she used their canvas top initially, then gradually replaced it with bark and smaller branches she had collected, creating a pitched roof that would shed any moisture that might seep from the cave ceiling above. The door was a simple frame covered with leather cut from her husband's old saddle, the one possession of his she had managed to keep. She hung it with the leather hinges, weighted it with stones at the bottom. It was not pretty, but it worked. Inside, she built raised sleeping platforms, using smaller logs and rope salvaged from their supplies. This kept them off the stone floor, away from any dampness that might creep in. She made a small hearth from flat stones, positioning it near the cabin's entrance where smoke could escape through a gap she had left near the roof line. The first time she tested the cabin, Ilara could not believe the results. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero. The wind howled across the prairie, driving snow before it like a white fury. Inside the cabin, inside the cave, with no fire burning at all, the temperature held steady at 52 degrees. She measured it 3 times with the small thermometer she had brought from the ranch house, certain she must be making a mistake. 52 degrees, warm enough to work in shirt sleeves, warm enough to sleep without shivering, warm enough to live. Her grandfather had been right. The earth remembered warmth. News traveled slowly on the frozen prairie, but it traveled. By the end of December, everyone in the territory knew about the Norwegian widow who had moved into a cave with her young son. The story spread from ranch to ranch, from the general store to the church steps, growing stranger with each telling. Most people thought she was insane. Dr. Ezra Whitmore was the first official visitor. He arrived on a gray afternoon, his horse picking its way carefully through the snow. Sheriff Virgil Holloway had asked him to check on the widow, more out of legal obligation than genuine concern. What he found baffled him. The cave entrance was partially blocked by a tumble of rocks and a canvas windbreak, but beyond that, a cleared path led deeper into the earth. Whitmore followed it, his medical bag clutched in one hand, his other hand trailing along the limestone wall for balance. The air grew warmer as he descended. That was his first surprise. The second was the cabin. It sat in an alcove off the main chamber, its walls sturdy and well built, a thin stream of smoke rising from a gap in the roof. A dog lay by the door, watching him with alert dark eyes, and beside a pond, impossibly, a woman was fishing. She stood as he approached, wiping her hands on her apron. She was younger than he had expected, with a face that might have been pretty if it were not so thin, so marked by exhaustion. "Mrs. Marsh, I am Dr. Whitmore. The sheriff asked me to look in on you." Elara nodded, her expression giving nothing away. "That is kind of him." Whitmore looked around the cave, taking in the fire pit. The drying fish hung from a wooden rack, the neatly stacked firewood, and the cabin. He could not stop staring at the cabin. "Mrs. Marsh, I have come to offer you a place at the county poorhouse. This cave dwelling, the dampness will kill you. You will catch pneumonia. Your son—" "Thank you, doctor. We are managing." She said it calmly, without anger or defensiveness, as if she were simply stating a fact that did not require discussion. Whitmore pressed on. "The poorhouse has beds, meals, medical care. You cannot survive a Kansas winter living in a hole in the ground like... He stopped himself before he said like savages, but the word hung in the air between them anyway. Elara's expression did not change. "My grandfather knew cold that would kill a man between one breath and the next. He made sure I knew it too." There was no arguing with her. Whitmore could see that. The set of her jaw, the steadiness of her gaze. She had made her choice. He left an hour later, shaking his head. "That cave will become their tomb," he told Sheriff Holloway that evening. "Mark my words." Others came after Whitmore. Reverend Josiah Crane arrived on a Sunday, fresh from delivering a sermon about the dangers of pride. "Pride goeth before destruction," he reminded Elara, standing in the cave entrance, as if afraid to venture further. "There are those among us who refuse Christian charity, who think themselves wiser than their neighbors. Let us pray for their souls." Elara listened politely, thanked him for his concern, and went back to weaving a fish trap from willow branches. Prudence Holloway, the sheriff's wife, did not bother coming in person. She preferred to spread the word from the safety of the general store, her voice carrying clearly to anyone who cared to listen. "Poor thing thinks she's stronger than Kansas winter, living in a cave like an animal, and that poor boy, raised like a wild creature. It is a mercy his father is not alive to see it." The words drifted back to Elara through the various channels of small-town gossip. She let them wash over her like water over stone. Words could not kill her. Winter could, and winter was the only enemy she cared about. But not everyone came to criticize. Old Silas Brennan appeared one morning in late December, his ancient mule picking its way up the frozen path to the cave entrance. He was 72 years old, a trapper who had worked these bluffs for decades, and he walked with the stiff gait of a man whose joints had been frozen and thawed too many times. He did not announce himself, just stood at the cave entrance, watching as Ilara fitted logs together for an extension to her cabin. After 20 minutes of silent observation, he spoke. I seen Norwegians build like that in Minnesota, back in 59. Double walls, air gap. Raised floor. Ilara paused, looking up at him. My grandfather. Silas nodded, as if this explained everything. Survived a winter that killed 40 men. Those Norwegians did. Everyone else froze or starved. They just kept on living. He fell silent again, watching her work. When he finally left, he pressed something into her hand. A small package wrapped in oiled cloth, salt pork, dried apples, a bag of flour. Girl knows something we do not, Virgil, he told the sheriff later. You will see soon enough. Holloway shook his head. Old man's gone soft. But Silas was not the only one who saw something different in the cave widow. Ezekiel Garrett was 16 years old, the son of the town blacksmith, with more curiosity than sense. He had heard the stories about the crazy Norwegian woman, and they fascinated him. One afternoon, he made his way up to the cave, telling himself he was just going to look. He found Stellan sitting by the pond, a fishing line in his hand, watching the water with the focused intensity of a born hunter. The boy looked up at Zeke's approach, his gray eyes wary but not afraid. Mama says strangers should announce themselves. I am not a stranger. I am Zeke from town. Stellan considered this. Mama is in the cabin. You can go see her if you want. Ilara was not angry when Zeke appeared in her doorway. She studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. Come in, see what everyone is talking about. She showed him everything, the double walls with their air gap, the raised sleeping platforms, the clever way smoke was channeled out through a gap in the roof that aligned with a natural fissure in the cave ceiling above. How did you know to build it like this? Zeke asked, genuinely curious. My grandfather. He taught me what the mountains of Norway taught him. She handed him a cup of fish broth, warm from the small fire that burned in the hearth. Zeke stayed for an hour, asking questions, absorbing information like a sponge. When he left, he carried with him not condemnation, but wonder. He came back the next week with a small bag of cornmeal, stolen from his mother's pantry. He did not tell anyone where he went, and then Horace Marsh found out where his former sister-in-law was living. He arrived in mid-January with Sheriff Holloway in tow, his face red with cold and righteous indignation. That cave is on federal land. She has no right to be there. I want her removed. Holloway looked at Horace, then at the cave entrance, then back at Horace. Is there a law against living in a cave, Horace? There must be. She cannot just squat there like some kind of... He sputtered, unable to find the words. Holloway sighed. Unless she is breaking some actual law, I cannot do anything. She is not bothering anyone. She is not stealing. She is just living. Horace's face went dark with fury. When she freezes to death, her blood is on your hands. He turned and rode away without another word. Holloway watched him go, then looked toward the cave entrance. For a moment he thought he saw movement in the shadows, the glint of watching eyes. He shook his head and turned his horse toward town. None of my business, he muttered to himself. None of my business. The cabin was completed by the end of December. 8 feet by 10 feet of solid construction, warmer than any building in the territory. And then the cave itself tried to kill them. 3 days after New Year, Ilara was outside gathering firewood when she heard it, a sound like thunder, deep and resonant, coming from inside the earth itself. Then a crash that shook the ground beneath her feet. She ran. The entrance was half blocked by fallen rock, dust billowing out into the cold air like smoke from a fire. She could hear Odin barking frantically, could hear Stellan's voice calling for her, thin and terrified. Mama, Mama. She scrambled over the rubble, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Inside, the dust was so thick she could barely see. She pulled her scarf over her mouth and pushed forward. The collapse had happened near the entrance, perhaps 30 feet from their cabin. A section of the ceiling had given way, sending tons of rock crashing to the floor. But the cabin itself, set back in its alcove, was untouched. Stellan stood in the doorway, his face white with dust and fear. Odin pressed against his legs, still barking. Ilara gathered them both into her arms and held them until she stopped shaking. The damage, she realized as the dust settled, was not as catastrophic as she had feared. The collapse had actually created a natural barrier near the entrance, a wall of tumbled stone that blocked the worst of the wind better than her canvas ever had. The cave was settling, finding its new shape, and in doing so, it had made itself stronger. Her grandfather would have understood. The earth knows what it needs. Trust it. But the collapse had left its mark, a deep bruise on Ilara's shin where a falling stone had struck her, a crack in one wall of the cabin that she spent 2 days repairing, and a new awareness, sharp and constant, that safety was never permanent. Nothing was permanent, except the knowledge that had kept them alive. Let me pause here and ask you to remember a number, 52 degrees. That is what Ilara measured inside her cabin on days when the temperature outside dropped to 40 below. 52 degrees, without modern heating, without electricity, without anything but knowledge passed down from her grandfather, a man who had learned to survive in the frozen lands of Norway, where winter could last 8 months. Remember that number. It will matter soon. In late January, Ingrid Dahl came to visit. She was 35 years old, a widow like Ilara, a Swedish immigrant who had lost her husband to the Kansas winter 4 years earlier. She lived alone in a small cabin 8 miles from the cave, surviving on stubbornness and the skills she had brought from the old country. She did not come empty-handed. Flour, salt, candles, a small jar of preserved berries. "We are sama sort," she said, pressing the gifts into Ilara's hands. "We are the same kind." They sat together in the cabin while Stellan fished and Odin dozed by the door. They spoke in a mixture of English and Scandinavian, sharing stories of the old countries, of the endless winters, of the knowledge their grandparents had carried across the ocean. "My husband said Kansas winter was nothing," Ingrid said quietly. "He was wrong. He died in 84, walked out to check the cattle and never came back. I found him in spring." Ilara reached out and took her hand. "I am sorry." Ingrid shrugged, a gesture that held more grief than words could express. "Now I live alone. Now I know what you know. The old ways, the ways that keep us alive." Before she left, Ingrid paused at the cave entrance, looking up at the grey sky. "My bones ache. Big storm coming. The worst I have felt in years." She was right. The children's blizzard began on January 12th, 1888. It started with warmth. That morning the temperature rose to nearly 40 degrees, an impossible gift in the middle of a Kansas winter. Children were sent to school without their heavy coats. Farmers ventured out to check their livestock. People stood in the sunshine and thanked God for the reprieve. Elara knew better. She stood at the cave entrance, Odin pressed against her legs, and watched the sky. It had a yellow tinge to it, a sickly color that did not belong to any normal winter day. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. Warmth before cold is death's whisper. She went back inside and began to prepare. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the sky turned black, not dark, black. Within 15 minutes, the temperature dropped from 40 degrees to 20 below zero. The wind rose from nothing to 60 miles per hour, driving snow before it in horizontal sheets that cut visibility to zero. In schoolhouses across the prairie, teachers looked out their windows and saw nothing but white. In fields and farmyards, men who had stepped outside for just a moment found themselves lost in their own yards, unable to see the houses they had left seconds before. The children's blizzard had arrived. In the cave, Elara heard the wind begin to howl, a sound like every train in the world arriving at once. She pulled Stellan close and held him. Odin pressed against them both, whimpering softly. For 3 days the storm raged. The temperature dropped to 47 degrees below zero, a record that would stand for decades. The wind chill made it feel like 70 below. Snow fell so thick and fast that it did not fall at all. It flew sideways, driven by winds that could knock a grown man off his feet. In the cave, Elara measured the temperature, 52 degrees. She cooked fish stew on her small fire, while the world outside died. She read to Stellan from her grandfather's journal stories of the old country, of winters even worse than this one, of people who survived through knowledge and stubbornness and refusal to give up. On the second day of the storm, Odin began to bark. It was not his usual bark, not the alert sound he made when someone approached. This was urgent, frantic, a sound Elara had never heard from him before. She followed him to the cave entrance, where the roar of the wind was so loud she could barely think, and she heard voices, human voices, calling out in the white void beyond the entrance. "Help, please, help us." Now I want you to pause again and imagine this moment. Elara standing at the entrance to her cave, warm and safe, with food and water and shelter. Outside, in temperatures that would kill an unprotected person in minutes, voices crying for help. Those voices belonged to people who had mocked her, who had called her crazy, who had predicted her death with something close to satisfaction. What would you do? Elara did not hesitate. She grabbed a rope from her supplies, tied one end to a boulder near the entrance, and stepped out into the storm. Sheriff Virgil Holloway had been on his way home when the storm hit. One moment he could see his house, a dark shape against the gray sky. The next moment there was nothing but white. The wind knocked him off his horse, and by the time he got to his feet, the animal had vanished. He walked in what he thought was the right direction. He walked for what felt like hours. When he finally saw the dark mouth of the cave entrance, he did not believe it was real. He thought it was a hallucination, a final vision before the cold took him. Then a rope landed at his feet. He grabbed it with numb fingers and let himself be pulled towards safety. Prudence Holloway had been with her husband, riding home from a visit to a neighboring farm. She had been the one to mock Elara most viciously, to spread the stories about the crazy cave woman, to predict her death with barely concealed satisfaction. Now she stumbled into the cave behind her husband, her face white with cold, her lips blue, her body shaking so hard she could not speak. "Please, please let us in. I am so sorry. I am so sorry." Elara did not say a word. She simply guided them deeper into the cave, toward the warmth, toward safety. Over the next 3 hours, 11 more people found their way to the cave. Zeke Garrett, caught in the open while checking on a neighbor. Dr. Whitmore, making a house call when the storm struck. The entire Peterson family, 5 of them, including the pregnant young wife, fleeing their collapsing farmhouse. 2 ranch hands from a spread to the north, half frozen and barely conscious. And Ingrid Dahl. She had walked 8 miles through the worst of the storm, following the memory of her visit weeks before. When she stumbled into the cave, her clothes were stiff with ice, her face blue-white with cold, her body trembling so violently she could not stand. But she was alive. "I knew you would be here," she whispered, as Alara wrapped her in blankets and pulled her close to the fire. "I knew you would survive. 13 souls in all, counting Alara and Stellan. 13 people sheltered in a cave while the world above them died. The next 5 days were unlike anything any of them had experienced. Ilara's cabin was too small to hold everyone, so she organized the cave itself into living spaces. The main chamber, warmed by its position deep underground, became a communal area. People slept on beds of dried grass and spare blankets, huddled together for warmth. Ilara and Stellan taught them to fish. At first, the others were skeptical. Fish? From an underground pond? In the middle of a blizzard? But hunger is a powerful teacher, and soon even Doctor. Whitmore was crouching by the pond with a line in his hand, waiting for a bite. Stellan showed Zeke how to make fish hooks from bone. You take the small bones from the fish we already ate. You carve them like this, see? Make the point sharp. Make the curve just right. My mama taught me. Her grandpa taught her. Now I teach you. The 16-year-old listened with the focused attention of someone who understands he is learning something valuable, something that might save his life someday. Zeke's hands were clumsy at first, the bone crumbling under his knife, but Stellan was patient, guiding him through each step, correcting his grip, showing him the proper angle. By the 3rd day, Zeke had made 3 hooks that actually worked. "You are a good teacher," he told the 8-year-old boy. Stellan shrugged, but there was pride in his eyes. "The old ways are not hard. You just have to pay attention." On the 3rd night, one of the Peterson women went into labor. She was young, barely 20, and the stress of the storm had brought on contractions 2 weeks early. Dr. Whitmore examined her with trembling hands, his face grave. "There is nothing I can do. My supplies, my instruments, everything frozen or lost." Ilara stepped forward. "I have delivered calves. I have delivered foals. A baby cannot be so different. It was not an easy birth." The young woman screamed and wept and begged for her mother, but Ilara talked her through it, held her hand, told her stories about her own son's birth, about the generations of women who had brought children into the world in far worse conditions. At dawn on the 4th day, a baby boy took his first breath in a cave 40 feet underground, while outside the temperature dropped to 47 degrees below zero. They named him Magnus. It seemed only right. The storm broke on January 17th. Ilara was the first to step outside, blinking in the sudden sunlight. The world had been transformed. Snow lay in drifts 20 feet high against the bluff. The sky was a pale, washed blue, and the silence was absolute. "We need to check on the others," Sheriff Holloway said, coming up behind her. His voice was hoarse, his face still marked by the frostbite he had suffered during his time in the storm. Ilara nodded. "I will come with you." What they found broke her heart. 67 people had died across the region. farmers caught in their fields, children lost on their way home from school, whole families frozen in houses where the fires had gone out. The Marsh ranch had not escaped. Cornelius and Adelaide had survived, but barely. The roof of the main house had collapsed under the weight of the snow, and they had spent 4 days huddled in the root cellar, eating raw potatoes and praying for rescue. Horace had lost 3 fingers to frostbite. He had gone outside to get firewood and lost his way in his own yard. By the time he found his way back, the damage was done. Ilara stood in the ruins of the house where she had lived for 6 years, looking at the people who had thrown her out to die. Cornelius would not meet her eyes, but Sheriff Holloway had something else to show her. In the wreckage of Horace's room, buried under fallen timbers, he had found a strong box. Inside were documents, contracts, letters, evidence. Horace had forged Samuel's signature on mineral rights agreements. He had sold land that was not his to sell. He had pocketed $2,000 that should have gone to the estate, to Ilara, to Stellan. It was all there in black and white. The trial, such as it was, took place in the general store 3 weeks later. The circuit judge had been delayed by the storm, so Sheriff Holloway presided over a preliminary hearing. Horace sat in a chair by the stove, his bandaged hand cradled against his chest, his face the color of old snow. Cornelius sat beside him, aged 20 years in 3 weeks. The evidence was presented, the documents, the forged signatures, the testimony of bank clerks who had processed payments that Horace had claimed for himself. It was open and shut. Horace Marsh, you are charged with forgery and fraud. You will be held until the circuit judge arrives. If convicted, you face 10 years in the territorial prison. Holloway's voice was flat, emotionless. He had known the Marsh family for decades. This was not easy for him, but justice was justice. As the sheriff led Horace away, Cornelius finally looked at Ilara. She had not spoken during the hearing, had not needed to. The evidence spoke for itself. Samuel would be ashamed of me, Cornelius said, his voice cracking. The land, take it back. It was always meant for you and the boy. Ilara looked at him for a long moment. In his eyes she saw regret, real regret, the kind that comes too late to change anything. He was an old man who had made terrible choices, who had let greed and pride destroy his family, who had thrown a widow and child out into the winter cold because they were inconvenient. He deserved her hatred, but hatred was too heavy to carry, and Ilara had already carried enough. I do not want your land, Mr. Marsh. Her voice was calm, steady, the voice of a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side. I have built my own home. What I want is the deed to the land around my cave. 100 acres. I will pay a fair price. Cornelius stared at her. That worthless bluff? There is nothing there but rock and scrub. Ilara smiled, the first smile anyone had seen from her since Samuel's death. My grandfather found that cave 33 years ago. He carved his initials in the wall. Now it is mine. She named her price, $23, the same amount she had carried out of the Marsh house on the day they threw her out. Cornelius signed the deed that afternoon. I want you to pause here and think about this choice. Ilara could have taken back the ranch, the home where she had lived for 6 years with the husband she loved, the land that was rightfully hers, but she chose the cave instead. She chose the place she had built with her own hands, the place where she had saved 11 lives, the place where her grandfather had carved his initials 33 years before she was born. She chose freedom over comfort, legacy over inheritance, the future over the past. Would you have made the same choice? Spring came slowly to Kansas that year. The snow melted in fits and starts, revealing the devastation the blizzard had left behind. Dead cattle dotted the prairies. Collapsed buildings marked where homes had once stood. Fresh graves appeared in every cemetery. But life returned, as it always does, and people remembered. They remembered the cave where 13 people had survived the worst storm in Kansas history. They remembered the widow who had taken in the very people who had mocked her. They remembered the baby born underground, the fish pulled from a spring-fed pond, the warmth that existed 40 feet below the frozen surface of the earth. They came to learn, 7 families in that first spring, making the journey to Elara's cave to see how she had done it, to learn the techniques her grandfather had taught her, to understand how still air and earth and ancient knowledge could mean the difference between life and death. Elara taught them all, and she did not charge a penny. Knowledge that saves lives should not cost money. Zeke Garrett became her first official apprentice. He spent his weekends at the cave, learning to build double walls, to read the signs of weather, to respect the wisdom of people who had lived in cold lands for thousands of years. Dr. Whitmore wrote a paper about it, Cave Thermal Stability in Extreme Weather Conditions. It was published in a medical journal back east, and scientists began to take notice. Old Silas Brennan just smiled whenever anyone mentioned the cave widow.
Told you all, girl knew something, but does anyone listen to an old man? Never until he is proven right. Prudence Holloway never spoke of those days in the cave, but she stopped spreading gossip about the Norwegian widow, and once, just once, Elara saw her in the general store, buying flour and salt in quantities far larger than one household needed. She was taking them to someone who could not afford them. People can change. Sometimes it just takes nearly dying to show them how. 40 years passed. Elara Marsh died in 1928 in the expanded cabin she had built near the mouth of her cave. She was 68 years old, and she died peacefully, surrounded by her son, her grandchildren, and the community she had helped to build. Stellan had become an engineer, specializing in what he called earth-sheltered architecture. He designed buildings that used the same principles his mother had learned from her grandfather, structures that stayed warm in winter and cool in summer with minimal heating or cooling. He married a schoolteacher from Topeka. They had 3 children. He never forgot where he came from. Zeke Garrett spent his life teaching survival skills, first informally, then as an official instructor for the Boy Scouts of America. Every young man he taught heard the story of the cave widow and the children's blizzard. The baby, born in the cave, Magnus Peterson, grew up to be a doctor. He delivered over 2,000 babies in his career, and he kept a small piece of limestone from the cave on his desk until the day he died. Odin passed away in 1898, 14 years old and grey around the muzzle. Elara buried him near the cave entrance, in a spot where the morning sun fell warm even in winter. The headstone read, "He found the cave. He saved us. Rest now, good boy." In 1978, a team of researchers from Kansas State University conducted a study of the cave.
They found the cabin Elara had built, remarkably preserved after 90 years. They found the fishing hooks carved from bone, the fire-blackened stones of her hearth, the wooden pegs she had used instead of nails, and on the wall they found 2 sets of initials carved into the limestone, MT 1854, E M. 1888. Magnus Torvik, Ilara Marsh. Grandfather and granddaughter, separated by decades in an ocean, united by knowledge that had saved lives. The researchers installed temperature sensors throughout the cave. They monitored conditions for a full year through summer heat and winter cold. The readings were consistent, 52 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round, regardless of outside conditions. Exactly what Ilara had measured almost a century before. The cave is now a historical site, preserved and protected. Visitors can walk the same path Ilara walked, can see the alcove where she built her cabin, can stand by the pond where she and Stellan caught fish while the world above them froze. A plaque near the entrance tells her story. It ends with a quote, words that Ilara spoke to a newspaper reporter years after the blizzard, when asked how she had survived when so many others had not. They called me crazy when I dug into that cave. They called me a hero when I saved them, but I was just a mother doing the only thing I knew how to do. Listen to my grandfather. Trust myself. Never give up. Sometimes that is all you need. This is where I want to leave you with one final thought. Ilara Marsh was not special. She was not superhuman. She was not blessed with abilities that ordinary people do not possess. She was a woman who had been taught something valuable and who had the courage to use it when everyone around her said she was wrong. The people who mocked her were not evil. They were simply certain that they knew better, certain that their experience, their education, their position in society gave them wisdom that a Norwegian widow could not possibly possess. They were wrong, and 67 people died because of that certainty. But 13 people lived because one woman refused to let their mockery shake her faith in what she knew to be true. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Knowledge passed down through generations is not foolishness. It is not superstition. It is the accumulated wisdom of people who faced the same challenges we face and found ways to survive. Listen to your elders. Trust your instincts. And never let anyone tell you that what you know is worthless. The cave is still there. The pond still holds fish. The temperature still holds at 52 degrees, winter or summer, just as it did when Magnus Torvik first carved his initials in the limestone wall more than 170 years ago. Some things endure. Knowledge is one of them. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who has been told their knowledge does not matter. Their experience is worthless. Their wisdom is outdated. Tell them about Ilara. Tell them about the cave. Tell them that sometimes the people everyone calls crazy are the only ones who truly understand. Thank you for listening.
Some days, life pushes you out of home with only a few dollars in your pocket, a child holding your hand, and a winter wind trying to erase every last bit of hope. In moments like that, the most terrifying thing isn't the snow or the storm. It's the feeling of being treated as worthless. But the truth is, your worth is not decided by someone else's judgment. It is proven by how you rise when no one is standing beside you. Don't be afraid when people call you crazy for choosing a different path. Sometimes the choices that look strange are the ones that keep you alive. Knowledge, persistence, and courage can turn darkness into shelter. And when you become strong enough to save yourself, you become strong enough to save others too.